We are in part number 112. We're actually going to go, I think, more lessons than we did in John's gospel, which is kind of incredible. There's more chapters in Matthew, so that helps. But almost as many lessons as Genesis, which is also incredible, considering it took 2.5 years to get through Genesis. So Matthew, part 1, we're in the Perfect Person of God, part 112. Today we are going to be in Matthew 26, finishing up Matthew 26. Maybe, I'm prepared to get to Matthew 27 today. Hopefully we'll get there. But I want to talk briefly about a couple of things. The first is the progression of Jesus in his ministry. We've been talking about Jesus as the perfection of God's people. The perfection of all the promises, the fulfillment of all the promises and all the prophecies rest in Jesus. But as we've turned into Matthew 26, and we've seen even the elements of like the Passover, we see that Jesus is also the perfection of the Passover, where in the book of Exodus, the people of God were spared from the angel of death during the final curse on the Egyptians because of the Passover lamb. Jesus takes on the Passover lamb imagery to himself. At the same time, Matthew 26, as we've gone through this, might be one of the, if not the loneliest chapter in the ministry of Jesus' life. We've seen the plot to kill Jesus by the leaders of God's people. We've seen Jesus predict his own rejection by his closest followers. And this even extends into what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. What happens in the Garden of Gethsemane? Jesus brings his followers into the garden so he can pray. He brings his three closest followers closer in, and what do? Do they pray for him at all? No, they just sleep. And then that loneliness intensifies as he is betrayed by one of his own. Even as one of his disciples, we know as Peter, brings a sword, they ultimately run and hide. This all caps what John chapter 1 talks about. In John chapter 1, it says, he came to that which was his own, and yet what? His own received him not. He came to that which was his own. He came to his own people, the people who should have recognized him as the perfection of all the promises and the prophecies of the Old Testament, but they do not get it. To the person, even the ones who follow him most closely, day in and day out, they do not get it. And so the leaders of the people of God, the council, the Sanhedrin, bring him to this trial, which is the epitome of rejection. And so he is abandoned. He's lied about. He's mocked. And he's beaten. And all of this, he not only readily accepts, but he walks into it willingly. It's not swords. It's not legions of angels. He goes, like the prophet Isaiah says, like a lamb to the slaughter. And he only answers one question in his trial. Are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of God? It's the only time he really answers a charge. And it's not really a charge, it's just a question. Are you the Son of God? And that brings with it the opportunity for Jesus to say, you have said so. Or as Mark's gospel says, I am. To which they levy the charge of blasphemy. And so they prepare to condemn him to death. We're going to see how that condemnation works at the beginning of Matthew chapter 27. Along the way, we've seen his disciples, and we've seen specifically Peter. Now, the journey of Peter in Matthew's gospel is an interesting one. He is first mentioned. I'm going to write these references down so you can cross-check them. We're not going to quote them. But he's first mentioned in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, as being one of the first disciples out on the Sea of Galilee, and he's fishing, and Jesus calls the fishermen, and what does he say? Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And so it says, interestingly, that they immediately, Matthew makes the point to say, they immediately drop their nets to follow. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, he's listed, Peter is listed just as part of one of the 12. But then earlier than that, in 8:14, we see that Peter's home is actually the hub of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, because that is where we see Peter's mother-in-law, who is sick, be healed by Jesus. And if you'll remember Matthew chapter 8, there's this series of 3 healings, and Peter's mother-in-law is right there in the middle. She's one of those who is outside the center of Jewish life, and yet Jesus heals her, along with a leper and a Roman centurion's servant. So we see this kind of the entry point to Peter, but then when you get to Matthew chapter 14, we really start to flesh out who Peter is. So in Matthew 14, beginning with verse 28, Jesus has been teaching. He sends his disciples out on the Sea of Galilee. The storm begins or the wind begins to kick up. The storm begins to rage. Jesus sees no problem and begins to walk on water. And you'll remember the disciples in the boat, everyone who's in the boat, they are rightly terrified. You see somebody walking out on the water, you should be terrified. Maybe about your own mental health. And they are, right? They scream. But what does Peter do? What does Peter do? First he says, if it's you, call me out to the water. And what happens? Jesus says, come on, let's take a walk. And this is the part where Peter, I think, gets a bad rap because he's the only one that gets out of the boat. He's the only one. The other disciples are too terrified, too afraid. Peter trusts. Now, does it go well for him? No. And in some ways, I see the walking on water scene as a microcosm of Peter's journey entirely, because the getting out of the boat, that's an act of faith, is it not? And I know Jesus says it's a little faith. I think it's a lot of faith. I don't know how to tell you. But his gaze turns to the waves, and he begins to fear, and he sinks. So you have this moment that's a high, and then a literal low, where Jesus has to rescue him. We see this again in Matthew chapter 16. Well, let's go back to 15 for just a second. 15, verse 15, is the Mount of Transfiguration scene. This is where Peter, James, and John accompany Jesus up to the mountain, and who joins them on the mountain? But Elijah and Moses. Now, Peter, again, being kind of the vocal representative of the other disciples, he is blown away, and he says, hey, let's pitch some tents here and let's camp, because this is a holy place. Now, that sounds great, Peter, but Jesus kind of corrects him. It's not a heavy rebuke, but he corrects him. Again, high. This is sort of a medium low. And it's nothing compared to what we see in 16. In 16, actually it's a little earlier than verse 16, Jesus asks the disciples some questions. Who do the people say that I am? And the disciples respond, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets, some say you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. And then Jesus asks another question, but you, who do you say that I am? And Peter pipes up. Again, high. He says, you are what? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He declares something that Jesus is going to be condemned for. He declares what all the Jewish leaders would have associated with blasphemy. Not the Messiahship part, but the Son of the living God. And Peter is as happy to make that declaration. Now, just a few verses later, verse 22, Jesus begins to predict his own death, his own trial, his own death, his own rejection. And Peter, this is like 7 verses later, after he's been given he's made this great declaration of faith, and Jesus has applauded him. He says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." Then Peter decides he's going to correct Jesus. When Jesus says, "I'm going to be crucified," begins to teach he's going to be crucified, he's going to die, Peter says, "Jesus, can we tamp down all that talk? You're making the other kids nervous." And what does Jesus say to Peter? "Get behind me, Satan. You have no part with me." This is Peter walking on the water and then sinking all over again, spiritually speaking. And it's because in that moment, he does not understand who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. He can talk the talk, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," but he doesn't understand what it takes to be the Messiah and the Son of the living God. To go where no one else can go, and to do what no one else can do. And I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. This is not the Transfiguration. 17 is the Transfiguration. There's much more that we could say about Peter's journey, but Peter begins to take this kind of vocal role throughout the Gospels. They talk about the temple tax. Jesus has this exchange about the temple tax. Peter's the one that asks about forgiveness. How many times must I forgive my brother? And that prompts Jesus to tell the story of the unforgiving servant. But then we get to Matthew 26. Matthew 26 is the lowest moment of Peter's ministry. Peter's life, probably. Because at the Passover meal, after Jesus makes the prediction that someone's going to betray him and that they will all deny him, what does Peter say? "Not me. Everybody else is going to fall away, but not me, even if I have to die with you." And then Jesus makes the prediction. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter tries to make good on his own claims that he will follow Jesus wherever he goes, that he will die with him. He's the one that pulls out the sword. Matthew does not mention that it's Peter, but we know it's Peter from John's Gospel. And what does Jesus do? He corrects Peter. He heals the servant Malchus, reversing the act of what Peter thinks is an act of bravery and faith. And then all the disciples abandon Jesus at his arrest. Matthew makes mention of the fact that after Jesus is arrested, Peter follows from a distance. And he goes all the way to the courtyard outside the trial. And that's where we pick up today in Matthew 26, beginning with verse 69. This is a very long chapter, guys, but this is the last pericope in this chapter. So let's read Matthew 26, beginning with verse 69. It says, "Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Galilean.' But he denied it before them all, saying, 'I do not know what you mean.' And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him. And she said to the bystanders, 'This man was with Jesus of Nazareth.' And again he denied it with an oath, 'I do not know the man.' After a little while, the bystanders then came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.' Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, 'Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly. All the Gospels record this moment of Peter's life. And it makes some sense on one hand, but it doesn't make a lot of sense on the other hand, because Peter is the vocal leader of the early church. If you look at the very first sermon of the church in Acts chapter 2, it's Peter that delivers that sermon. And that sermon is delivered before the Gospels are written. Nobody has the story of Jesus written down, so Peter, he's the one that actually tells the story of Jesus from the steps of the temple. He talks about the entirety of the history of God's people, and he says that it all culminates in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so it's interesting that the gospel writers would make mention of the fact that the great leader of the church is a failure. And you'll notice too that only John's gospel mentions any restoration. Now, the other gospels mention that Peter is there, that Peter discovers Jesus being resurrected. He's not banished, but they all mention his failure. Now, that said, each gospel has some variances in how this scene plays out, but much of that can be explained away by the priorities of the authors, whether to include various aspects of Jesus' so-called trial or not. Like I mentioned last week, John goes into much greater detail about the Roman side, whereas Matthew mentions the Roman side. We'll talk about that in a few moments, but doesn't get into great detail about what happens there. So in this scene, Peter is confronted by what I'm calling accusers. They're accusing him of being a follower of Jesus. In Matthew and Mark's gospel, we have two servant girls, one who directly addresses Peter, and another talks to the crowd about Peter, and he overhears it basically. And then a member of that crowd comes and confronts Peter directly. Now, Luke's gospel is a little bit more fuzzy on who is making these accusations. Luke uses the phrase, someone else comes and asks Peter. John actually separates the three denials into various locations, and he intersperses parts of Jesus' trial in them. And he's more vague as well about who is confronting Peter, except for one case. One of the servants that confronts Peter, John makes mention that it's actually a relative of Malchus, the man whose ear Peter has cut off. So I think that's an interesting detail, that one of the servant girls is actually a relative of the man that Peter has cut the ear off of. And they address Peter regarding his status based on a couple of things. What do you notice about the accusations? What do you notice about why they accuse him? There's a couple of reasons. What do you notice? Okay, first, part of it is where he's from, right? And they tie that to where Jesus is from. They'll say Jesus the Galilean or Jesus of Nazareth, and then they accuse Peter of being associated with him because he has a Galilean accent. Sometimes we don't think about this, that even in those regions there are different accents. We think of accents as being like, British accents. But even in our country, even in our state, we have a variety of accents. Like, I know people that can tell you what part of Alabama you're from based on your accent. Like, East Alabama, West Alabama has a little bit more of a fast accent. East Alabama is a little slower, more drawly. North, South. It's interesting, right? And so in Jerusalem, they were really keen to, they could identify the Galilean accent. Now, this is actually a derogatory kind of accusation, or basis for an accusation. You'll remember, if you know the beginning of John's gospel, when John talks about the calling of the disciples. Remember one of the disciples in John, if you open up to John chapter 2. Actually, John chapter 1. In let's go to verse 45, or verse 44. Philip has began following Jesus along with Andrew and Peter. And Philip finds a man named Nathanael and says to him, "We found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth." That's how Philip introduces Nathanael to Jesus. And what does Nathanael say? Can anything good come from Nazareth? The subtext is, no, nothing good can come from Nazareth. Now, I used to make a joke about that, and then I offended some people because they were from Mulberry, and so I don't make that joke anymore. But you get the point, right? That's this idea. You might, as you were growing up, you might think of a town where you're thinking, can anything good come from that town? That's the reputation that Nazareth had. And for the people in Jerusalem, the entirety of Galilee had that reputation. They were, for people in Jerusalem's the big city, right? Jerusalem is this cosmopolitan hub. It's where everybody comes for the festivals. People want to live in Jerusalem. And the people that are from Galilee, they're the Hicks. Nothing good comes from, this is like people who come, they kind of paint Southerners in a negative light if they're from the north. Does that ever happen to you? I'm looking at Terry's like, yeah. You have to tell them, just because I talk slow doesn't mean I'm stupid, right? Because they think that talking slow means you're slow, and that's not the case. But that's the reputation that some big city people have of, more rural areas. And Galilee was a rural area. And so Peter's accent betrayed where he was from. So there is this accusation based on where Jesus is from and that relationship to Peter. What's the other reason people accuse Peter? What's the basis of their accusation? Who he's seen with. People have actually seen him. Now, if you look at John's gospel and one of the servant girls being a relative of Malchus, it's very likely that Malchus, who was there, remember, he's healed, he was there because he's a servant of the high priest, and the high priest is putting Jesus on trial, that Malchus said to his relative, that guy was the guy who cut my ear off. To which the servant girl might have said, your ear is firmly attached to your head right now. And then he would have to admit that the man that is standing trial for being the Son of God healed me. But Malchus would have seen Peter for sure. One of the servants would have known that Peter was with Jesus. Now, Peter's denial of these accusations is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, his denials were public. It wasn't as though these servants came to Peter and then he took them aside and said, hey, you know what, I'm not really one of those guys. No. It says that in verse 70, he denied it before them all. And there is a crowd. There are bystanders. There are people watching because there's been a stir. There are people around, and he is denying knowing who Jesus is before them all. And not only that, but his denials are impassioned. They're not like kind of casual, hey, you know what, you guys are mistaken. I wasn't with that guy. No. And they escalate in their passion. Because at first he denies it, then he swears an oath, I swear I don't know him, and then by the third time, what is he doing? He's yelling. He's calling curses down on himself. He's actually condemning himself if he's lying. It's kind of like cross my heart and hope to die. I hate that phrase, by the way. But that's like a curse that you're placing on yourself. Cross my heart and hope. You guys ever said this? When you're kids? People say, no, you're not going to do that. Cross my heart and hope to die. That's a curse that you're invoking on yourself. And this is what Peter's doing, except like ratcheted up a notch or 10 notches. It's an impassioned denial of his relationship with Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but I always think of these denials happening in succession, right? Like one right after the other. But the way John's gospel kind of lays it out is that these denials are actually happening over several hours. They're not happening all at once. So one person is denying him, or one person is accusing him and he's denying it. An hour or two goes by, another person is accusing him, denying him. There are conversations happening about who Jesus is. There are conversations happening about his associates. Hey, I think I saw this guy with him. And so this is happening over the course of time, and Peter is feeling more and more the pressure of what is happening. And that quality of time is needed to elevate the intensity of the moment. So at the third denial, the rooster crows. And Peter remembers the saying of Jesus. And Matthew actually requotes it. He actually requotes it. Now, the interesting part about this is, how does Matthew know what Peter remembers? Because Peter told Mark, because Mark is one of Peter's disciples, and Mark cross-checks his story with Mark's story. That's how he knows. John Mark, yeah, that's what we believe. Yes, John Mark. You'll see John Mark mentioned in the book of Acts as being associated with Peter, and so that's where we believe Mark got most of his information, because John Mark, to the best of our knowledge, was not with Jesus. He's definitely not listed anywhere in the Gospels. Now, Luke's Gospel tells us one more interesting detail. It actually says in Luke chapter 22, if you look at Luke 22, verse 61, this is a chilling detail. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And then Peter remembered the saying. Now, how is that possible? Probably through a window. The courtyards are open air, and it's not as though they have closed, locked doors necessarily at this moment. Peter can see into the proceedings, and Jesus more than likely can see out. It's a chilling detail that only Luke includes, and that is the thing that prompts Peter's memory of what Jesus has said to him. Now, Matthew is interesting in that he has been tracking the journey of Peter very specifically. Next to John's gospel, Matthew tracks Peter's life and journey with Jesus more than any other. He tracks Jesus' life more than any other synoptic gospel. But this is the last time we see Peter in Matthew's gospel. It's the last time he's mentioned. Now, obviously, we know from the other Gospels that Peter is there during various points of the resurrection story, and also John is the only one that tells the story of the reestablishment of the relationship between Jesus and Peter. But Matthew leaves this hanging out there, and the weight of Peter's denial hanging. Now, he does that not for Peter's sake, but to show the abandonment by Jesus. So, from there, after Peter leaves and exits the scene, we get a small little snippet of a story in Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27, verses 1 and 2, it says, "When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death, and they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor." Now, you might ask the question, wait, didn't they already do this? Didn't they already get together? Why is Matthew including this little snippet? Didn't they already condemn him to death? Well, there was a need for a formal decision because the council, the Sanhedrin, was unable to exact a capital punishment. So they wanted to put Jesus to death, but why did they want to put Jesus to death? What was the crime? Blasphemy. However, Jewish people could not put anyone to death. Who's going to have to do that? Rome. You know what Rome doesn't care about? Blasphemy. They're blaspheming all the time. They're polytheists. They worship multiple gods, and when they worship their gods, it's only practical as far as they're concerned. They don't have any. So if they go to Pilate and say, "Hey, this guy has committed blasphemy, we need to kill him," Pilate's going to be like, "I don't care," and Rome doesn't care. That's not a capital crime. So they have to come back together to figure out how are they going to accuse Jesus in a way where he will actually be put to death by the Romans. And so what they ultimately decide, as you read all the Gospels, is that they present Jesus' claims to be the king, which is treason. And Rome definitely cares about treason before they head to Pilate. Now, Pilate is mentioned here for the first time, and he's called a governor. In fact, Pilate, and we think of a governor as being someone who's an elected official, who's brought on by the people, but here, Pilate was actually appointed as a prefect, what we would think of as a prefect or a procurator. That is someone who is placed by a higher level of government in order to rule over a small area. Typically, it's an area that has trouble, and they have judicial powers, and they have more power than just a kind of a ruling governor, or even someone like Herod does. Pilate was actually appointed as the prefect by Caesar himself, by Tiberius Caesar, in 26 AD. And these procurators, these prefects, they usually held power for life in that area unless the Caesar or the emperor appointed them someplace else, moved them someplace else. Now, historians tell us that following the banishment of Archelaus in 6 AD, Judea and Samaria, which are two different regions, but they're neighbors, they were brought together into one province governed by the same prefect and procurator, which would have been, in this case, Pilate. And typically they lived at Caesarea by the sea, not Caesarea Philippi. If you remember our discussion on Matthew 16, there is a Caesarea Philippi up in the north of Galilee. That is where Jesus asked the question, "Who do the people say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" Caesarea by the sea is closer, it's right on the sea, not the Sea of Galilee, but it's on the Mediterranean Sea. And this is where a lot of Roman officials lived. And Caesarea by the sea becomes very important in the life of Peter, also becomes very important in the life of Paul in the book of Acts. And this is where Pilate would have lived, but would have come to Jerusalem during these festivals. Why? Because the festivals were points where large gatherings of Jewish people came together, and they were times of great religious zeal, and times where the Jewish people would have been very, very unhappy with Roman rule. And so they had to bring in more guards and more governance into Jerusalem during this festival to oversee and to prohibit any sort of radical uprising. So that's why Pilate is in Jerusalem. Now, Pilate, if you look at some extra biblical material, has a very specific view of what Pilate is like, what his attitude is like. Now, what you know of Pilate, how would you describe Pilate from what you know about Pilate? Wishy-washy? Huh? Job scared? afraid of Jesus, seems timid, seems to be scared of the Sanhedrin, what they can do. But the extra biblical picture of Pilate is very different than that, than what we see in the Bible. We're going to explain why that is the case in just a moment. But he's portrayed in places like Josephus in his Antiquities as a cruel and insensitive ruler who hated his Jewish subjects. And he took very few pains to actually understand them or to care about them. This is one of the reasons that the Sanhedrin has to come up with a legitimate reason to accuse Jesus, one that will actually pass muster. There's a story that he actually stole from the temple treasury, what they call the Corban money, in order to build an aqueduct. And the people of Jerusalem wanted to riot in protest of Pilate taking the temple money. And as a result, Pilate sent in soldiers to kill those who were rising up against him. He defiled Jerusalem more than once. Luke mentions this a bit in Luke chapter 13. And so this kind of power-hungry, insensitive, cruel image of Pilate, sometimes critics will say it runs counter to what we see in the Gospels. Wishy-washy, scared. So the question is, how do we balance that? How do we understand that? Well, it's possible that, as some commentators tell us, that Pilate appears weak in the Gospels because of several events that have happened in his life. A lot of times Roman rulers had specific patrons who helped fund their lifestyle. Well, just a couple of years before this moment, Pilate's patron had died. The man who was responsible for helping to elevate Pilate, he had died. Additionally, there had been a moment where Pilate had made a decision that ran afoul of the Jewish people, and which the Caesar Tiberius, actually rebuked Pilate publicly about it. That Pilate had made a poor error in judgment, and so Caesar had rebuked him. Another revolt by the Jewish people would have meant that Pilate would have lost his job. As Bruce said, he's job scared. And so he doesn't know really what to do with Jesus. He doesn't know what to do with the Jewish people. And so he understands that his former ways of cruelty are not going to keep his status secure. And so this is who we're introduced to in this moment in Matthew 27. So Matthew puts this tiny little detail in there between the denial of Peter and then what we see later, the suicide of Judas. And this is what we read in Matthew chapter 27, verse 3. Then Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, and he changed his mind. And he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what does that have to do with us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, says, it's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Now, Matthew's gospel is the only gospel to record Judas' death. However, Luke mentions the death of Judas in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, verse 16 through 19. This sets the stage for them to replace Judas by the casting of lots. They replaced Judas with Matthias, so that there are still 12 disciples. Now, if you read Acts chapter 1 and you read Matthew chapter 27, there are some differences in the two accounts. And they can be explained by the understanding of priority, the priority of the fulfillment themes in both Matthew and Acts. They can also be explained by just thinking through the chronology and our understanding or our lack of understanding of the Greek language. Matthew places this moment after Jesus' case has been sent to Pilate, because this underscores the death penalty nature of what's about to happen to Jesus. Had the council not sent Jesus' case to Pilate, what could they have done to him? Almost nothing. They could have kept him arrested. They could have, beaten him, which would have been terrible. But they would not have had the ability to kill him. And so this is what sets Judas off. And what you'll notice about this is that Matthew, unlike some of the other gospel writers, paints Judas in a slightly, and I'm going to say slightly, more sympathetic light. That he had some misunderstandings, he had some doubts, and this is what caused him to make this egregious error. But what this scene really does is to highlight something very important about Jesus and his crucifixion. Does Jesus deserve to die? He has been betrayed. As Judas says, I have betrayed what? An innocent man. Now, here's the part that gets really, really interesting. What does the council say as a result? What is that to us? What are they acknowledging in that phrase? What is the council acknowledging in that phrase? That the betrayal is of an innocent man. They're acknowledging that Jesus is innocent. Because if they didn't believe he was innocent, what would they have said? To the claim that Judas has betrayed an innocent man, what would they have said if they believed he was really guilty? You're lying. He's not innocent. He is guilty. We've heard it. Instead, they go, I don't care. It's not our problem. It's your problem. It should be their problem. We don't condemn innocent people to die, except that their priority was not innocence or guilt. Their priority was a nuisance. Jesus was a nuisance to them. And they take the accusation of blasphemy into their own court, but then they take the accusation of treason to the court of Pilate. Here, Judas is overwhelmed by regret and throws the money down, the 30 pieces of silver, and then the money is used to buy a field. In Acts, Judas uses the money to buy a field and then dies in it. Now, some have suggested that Judas hanged himself in the very field that the council bought with the money, that there's a timeline difference, that Judas throws the money down, they go buy a field either that day or the next day or the next week, and Judas is spiraling at this moment. He doesn't just run out and hang himself immediately. He runs out in guilt and in shame, and then after the field is purchased, there he dies. Now, in any case, what we know is that the council does not want to take the money into its own treasury because it's blood money. It's money used to betray a man unto his own death. Now, what's ironic about this is that these same men who are not concerned about killing an innocent man are really concerned about using the money for unlawful purposes. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, there's actually a law, Deuteronomy 23, verse 17 and 18. It talks about what treasury money can be used for, what it can't be used for, and what money can be used in the treasury. So, for example, it also mentions money that has been earned through prostitution. You don't put that in the temple treasury. I think that's obvious, right? So that blood money. There's this whole set of categories. But the irony of and we've seen this before. We've seen this before. The religious leaders are really concerned about keeping elements of the law, but not the heart of the law. And that's what Jesus accuses them of. That they're consistently looking at the nuances and the intricacies of trying to hold to those levels of the law, but they will not hold to the level of the law that says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. They won't hold to the heart of it. And so they miss Jesus entirely. Now, Matthew mentions not only the purchasing of the potter's field, but also that potter's field is still in existence even up to the time of Matthew's writing. That Matthew mentions this even up to the time of the readers hearing this story. Now, this adds credibility to the story. Why? Because people who read the gospel could cross-check that. It's like anytime I say something, I know you could Google it and see if I'm telling you the truth or not, right? Very intimidating time to be a preacher, let me just tell you that. Because you can always cross-check it. Well, Matthew and the other gospel writers add these little details because they can be cross-checked. If there were no details like this, then it would be much more difficult for the original reader to check to see if this is true. Finally, Matthew continues to use his fulfillment motif. And when I say fulfillment motif, remember, he consistently throughout the story of Jesus' life, he says this was done in order to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Now here, this is an odd one, because the allusion in most commentaries, or even if you've got a study Bible, it will not reference anything in Jeremiah, even though Matthew says Jeremiah. Most of your notes will probably point you to a line in Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 13. There, it says this: Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Then I broke my second staff union, annulling the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. It seems very close. So why does Matthew refer to Jeremiah when it seems like the allusion, it's not an exact quote, but the allusion comes from Zechariah? Well, there are a lot of theories about this. Jeremiah does mention a potter quite extensively in Jeremiah chapter 18 and Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 6. But in Jeremiah 19, Jeremiah is told to purchase a potter's jar and take some elders and priests to the valley. And he's there to warn of the destruction of Jerusalem for their sins. And it's illustrated by the smashing of the jar. There's also a linguistic link in Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 4, related to the innocent blood. And there are also other thematic links as well. So it's likely that Matthew has in mind both Zechariah and Jeremiah's symbolic usage of the potter's jar in Jeremiah. And I'll put the reference here, Jeremiah 19, beginning with verse 1. And these are taken as a token of God's judgment which does fall on Judas in this moment as well. Any questions? Yes, Caroline.
Let's go back a minute to Peter.
Okay.
You gotta love Peter.
I do.
His life was so high and low. Didn't have that middle ground.
Yeah.
And do you think after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and he was gone, that all of that led Peter to be such a stable, wonderful preacher that he was? And he didn't, his projection was total preaching and teaching.
Yeah, Carolyn, I had a professor, my doctorate, he said that Peter was my biblical spirit animal because I really resonate with Peter, the highs and the lows, and using the highs and the lows to ministry purpose. I think that is true. It is interesting, though. Peter's trajectory, we would love to think that Peter, after the resurrection, after the renewal in John chapter 21, you know, the do you love me, feed my sheep, that scene in John 21, we would love to think that Peter's spiritual trajectory was just like this the whole time. But even in the book of Acts, it's not. And into the new, there are moments where Peter has this and skyrockets, you know, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 3, Acts chapter 4, chapter 5. But then we get to the calling of the Gentile people, and Peter has a really difficult time with that. He has a really difficult time with the inclusion of the Gentiles. Jesus shows Peter a vision. If you know the story, he shows Peter a vision of all this, basically a divine picnic in heaven, right? And it's all this food, including bacon. And Peter is like telling the resurrected, ascended Jesus, I can't eat this. I've never eaten anything unclean. It's just like Peter in Matthew chapter 16, telling Jesus what he can and cannot do. And Jesus responds, don't call anything clean or unclean things that I've made clean. And then he tells him to go to Cornelius' house. And Peter makes mention when he's at Cornelius' house how big a deal it is that he's walking across the threshold of a Gentile's home, because he would never do that. In Galatians, in the book of Galatians, we see that Peter continues to have this problem because when Paul writes about a story in which Peter is with the Gentile people, but he separates himself and he only eats with the Jewish brothers. And it says, Paul says that he had to oppose Peter to his face. I mean, that means they had a knockdown drag. That's the Bible way of saying they were at each other's throats to some extent. But that Peter repented. But I think the ups and downs of Peter's life make him much more powerful a leader for God's people, because he understands. That's why you think about Paul, why he was such a great leader, because he understood the need for grace because he was a murderer before that, right? Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Yeah, Ray. Yeah.
And he was always the guy that thought he could solve a problem. So he didn't want to be, I always took it that he didn't want to be taken in because he wanted to be on the outside where he could help free Jesus.
Yeah, except when he does the denial, he runs away. Yeah, he runs away. Yeah, he was wrong. He's like, I'm out.
He realized the prophecy came true.
Yeah.
Then
he bolted.
My other question is, stonings took place a lot.
Yeah.
And they weren't really carried out. Jesus kept the adulterous woman from being stoned. He wasn't stoned when they tried to take him out of the temple. But Stephen was stoned.
Stephen was stoned. Actually,
how did that happen?
that's interesting because so the stonings were part of, obviously, the Jewish law. But when the Romans took over, it became much more rare. Much more rare. Stephen was stoned, which demonstrates how much of a problem the Christians became, for not only the Jewish people, but for the Roman people. That the Romans would allow a Christian to be stoned by the Jewish people shows us how much even the Christians were causing problems. And so you go back to this idea of trying to tamp down a potential revolt. And so for the Romans at that time, it was better at that moment, when we get to the stoning of Stephen, to tamp down the potential revolt by the Jewish people, which was a much bigger population than the Christians, by letting the Jewish people begin to take Christians out. So that's how that takes place, because the name of Jesus became a proverbial thorn in the side of the Romans. And we see this later on. I mean, later, when Roman persecution gets higher and higher, more intense, it's because they're seen as godless, they're seen as cannibals, they're seen as being, problematic in a lot of ways. So in that moment, they were saying they were allowing something that they would not have allowed before, right? Yeah, or I would say allowed to a much lesser extent. Okay? All right, let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this day and for your goodness to us, and ask that you would continue to open our hearts and our minds to what you would like, how you would like us to live out your word. Reminding us that all of us, in one way or another, have denied Jesus, maybe not with our words, but with how we have lived. Help us to repent and turn back to you, and be grateful for the ways in which you call us and welcome us back in. We pray this in Jesus' name.